I found my late wife's journal in a box I almost threw away. The recycling bin was sitting right there at the end of the driveway, half full of her old magazines and recipe clippings, and I had the journal in my hand, a plain brown thing with a worn elastic band around it, and I almost let it go. Something stopped me. I still don't know what. Maybe I just wasn't ready to let another piece of her disappear. Her name was Alice. We were married 41 years. She passed in March, quietly, the way she did most things, without making a fuss, without asking anyone to rearrange their lives for her. Pancreatic cancer. From diagnosis to the end was 11 weeks. I'm 67 years old, and I have never once in my life felt so completely unprepared for anything. The journal sat on my nightstand for 6 weeks before I opened it. I told myself I was respecting her privacy. The truth is, I was afraid of what I'd find. Not anything scandalous. I knew Alice. I was afraid I'd find her voice in those pages, and it would undo me completely. When I finally opened it, I was sitting at the kitchen table on a Tuesday morning in late May. Rain hitting the windows. Cup of coffee going cold. I read the first page and it was exactly what I expected. Notes about her garden, a grocery list, a reminder to call her sister in Kelowna. Then I turned a few pages and something fell out. A folded piece of paper tucked between the pages. Handwriting I didn't recognize. I unfolded it slowly. It was a letter. Handwritten, unsigned. And the first line stopped my breath entirely. Alice, if anything happens to you, your husband needs to know what we found. Don't let them bury this with you. I sat there for a long time. The rain kept going. My coffee went completely cold. I read that sentence probably 8 or 9 times before I turned the page and kept reading. The letter was from a woman named Petra. She and Alice had apparently been part of the same community watershed group, a volunteer organization that monitored water quality in and around our area in the Okanagan Valley. I hadn't known about it. Alice had mentioned going to meetings, but I thought it was the gardening club. I never asked. I should have asked. According to the letter, Petra and Alice had been collecting water samples along a stretch of Trout Creek for almost 8 months before Alice got sick. They'd been worried about runoff from a parcel of land to the north of us, about 12 kilometers up the valley. The land belonged to a company called Northgate Property Holdings. Petra's letter said they had lab results. She said the results were, in her words, not something that should be ignored. Then she'd written something that made my stomach drop. I tried to hand this over to the regional office last November. I was told the file had already been reviewed and closed. I know that's not true. Someone got to them first. I closed the journal. I opened it again. I read the letter a second time. I'm not a paranoid man. I spent 32 years as a high school geography teacher in Penticton. I coached junior hockey for 12 of those years. I am, by nature and by habit, a person who believes in institutions, in process, in doing things the right way. I am not someone who jumps to conclusions, but I sat there that Tuesday morning looking at an unsigned letter tucked into my dead wife's journal, and I thought, she knew something, and someone made sure it went nowhere. The first thing I did was find Petra. It took me 3 days. The Watershed Group had a website that hadn't been updated in about 2 years, but there was a contact form, and I filled it out explaining who I was. She called me the following afternoon, and the moment I heard her voice, cautious, measuring every word, I knew this was real. She asked me how I'd gotten her letter. I explained about the journal, about Alice hiding it between the pages. There was a long pause. I gave that to her in February, Petra said, just before she went to the hospital. She never mentioned it to me. She said she didn't want to worry you until she knew more. Another pause. She said she'd handle it herself when she got better. She didn't get better. Petra agreed to meet me the following Saturday at a coffee shop in Summerland. She brought a manila envelope stuffed with papers, printed lab reports, photographs, handwritten notes, a timeline she and Alice had put together over those 8 months. She spread it across the table and walked me through it slowly, like she'd been waiting a long time for someone to listen. The summary was this. Water samples taken downstream from the Northgate parcel showed elevated levels of trichloroethylene and several other industrial solvents, not dramatically elevated, not the kind of numbers that make headlines, but consistently elevated, over months, in a pattern that tracked with seasonal runoff from a specific area of that land. Petra had sent the samples to an independent lab in Vancouver. The results came back flagged. She'd submitted a formal complaint to the regional district office. A few weeks later, she received a letter back saying the matter had been investigated and no further action was required. No details, no follow-up, just closed. "Do you know who owns Northgate?" I asked her. She slid a piece of paper across the table. It was a corporate registry printout. I looked at the listed directors. One of the names was Douglas Hearn. I knew that name. Everyone in the South Okanagan knew that name. Douglas Hearn was the kind of man whose name appeared on plaques in hospital lobbies and on the donor walls of university buildings. He'd made his money in commercial real estate development, built half the new subdivisions spreading north from Penticton over the past 15 years. He sat on the board of the Regional Hospital Foundation. He golfed with the mayor. He was the kind of man who existed just slightly above the level where normal rules seemed to apply. I drove home from that coffee shop and I sat in Alice's garden for about an hour. She'd planted lavender along the south fence, and it was just starting to come up. I sat there and thought about her going to those watershed meetings, collecting water samples in little plastic vials, writing things in her careful handwriting, trying to protect something, trying to do the right thing quietly, without a fuss, the way she did everything. I decided then that I was going to finish what she started. The first person I told was our son-in-law, Owen. He's married to our youngest daughter, Celia, and he works as an environmental consultant out of Kelowna, mostly forestry contracts, but he knows the regulatory landscape cold. I drove up to see him on a Sunday and laid out everything Petra had given me on his kitchen table. Owen looked at the lab reports for a long time without saying anything. Then he looked up at me and said, "Dad, these numbers are real. This isn't nothing." "I know. You understand what you're getting into if you push this. Hearn's got lawyers who play full contact. He's got friends at the regional office. Clearly, this could get uncomfortable." "Alice spent 8 months on this," I said. "She didn't get to finish it." Owen was quiet for a moment. Then he nodded. "Okay, let me make some calls." What I didn't know, what I found out about 3 weeks later in a way I was completely unprepared for, was that my older daughter, Renee, already knew something was going on. Not about Alice, not about the water samples, but about the land. Renee is 51 years old. She lives in Vancouver, runs a small investment advisory practice, and she has always been, how do I put this, more drawn to the financial side of things than her sister. We're not estranged. We talk. But after Alice passed, Renee's main focus during the estate conversations was on what the house was worth and whether we ought to consider downsizing. I understood it. Grief makes people practical sometimes. I tried not to hold it against her. Owen called me on a Wednesday evening, 3 weeks after our kitchen table conversation. His voice was flat in a way I didn't like. "I need to tell you something," he said, "and I need you to hear me out before you react." He'd been making inquiries, quietly, through professional contacts, about the Northgate parcel and any pending development applications. And in doing that, he'd come across something. A numbered company had put in a letter of intent to purchase an option on a residential subdivision adjacent to that parcel. The numbered company was new, incorporated just 4 months earlier. One of the 2 directors listed was Renee. I didn't say anything for a long time. "She may not know," Owen said carefully, "about the contamination, about what Alice found. It's possible she was approached as an investor, and she knew I was asking questions," I said. "I mentioned it to her 3 weeks ago. She said she'd never heard of Northgate." Owen didn't say anything. She lied to me. I want to be careful here about how I describe what happened inside me that night, because it's complicated and I don't want to simplify it. I was angry. Of course I was angry, but underneath the anger there was something worse, a kind of grief I hadn't expected, a second loss sitting right on top of the first one, because Renee is my daughter, and I love her, and the idea that she had looked me in the face and lied about something connected to her mother's death was almost more than I could process. I didn't call her, not yet. I needed to think. I needed to understand the full shape of what I was dealing with before I said a word to anyone. Owen had a colleague, a woman named Dr. Susan Falk at UBC, who agreed to take a second look at the lab reports. She came back within 10 days with a more detailed analysis. Her conclusion was clear. The contamination pattern was consistent with improper disposal of industrial solvent waste, likely from an operation that had been active on the Northgate parcel intermittently over several years. The concentrations downstream were below the threshold for an emergency order, but well above what would be acceptable for a site being considered for residential development. Families with wells. Children. She also said something that I keep coming back to. She said, someone with access to these results would have known this land couldn't be developed without expensive remediation, which means either they plan to hide it or they plan to make someone else pay for the cleanup after the fact. I took everything. Petra's envelope, Owen's findings, Dr. Peirce, Balk's analysis. And I drove to Penticton, and I walked into the office of a lawyer named Clive Barton, who had handled our wills and had been a friend of mine since our hockey association days. I laid it all on his desk. He read through it for 45 minutes while I sat there. When he was done, he took off his glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose. "You know what this looks like," he said. "Tell me what it looks like." "It looks like someone used their connections at the regional office to kill a legitimate environmental complaint, and then move to develop or facilitate investment in land they knew was contaminated. If that's what happened, you're potentially looking at fraud, regulatory obstruction, and depending on how the contamination spread, environmental liability under the Canadian Environmental Protection Act." And my daughter? Clive was quiet for a moment. That depends on what she knew and when she knew it. If she genuinely didn't know about the contamination, she may be a victim of this as much as anyone. If she did know. He didn't finish the sentence. I said, "I need to know which one it is before this goes any further." I called Renee that evening. I drove to a pull-off on the highway above Skaha Lake, and I sat in my truck and called her. I told her I knew about the numbered company. I told her I knew about the option on the subdivision. I told her I knew she'd lied to me. The silence on the other end of the line was long enough that I started to wonder if she'd hung up. Then she said, "Dad, I can explain." And she did. She explained for almost an hour. The version she gave me was this. A man she knew through professional circles, a developer named Troy Callahan, had approached her about 6 months ago with what he described as a ground floor opportunity in a new residential development north of Penticton. He'd presented it as low risk, strong upside, fast timeline. She'd done some surface-level due diligence, but not enough. She had not known about the environmental issue. She had not known about Northgate's connection to Douglas Hearn specifically, though she knew Callahan worked in Hearn's orbit. When I'd mentioned I was asking questions about a company called Northgate, she'd panicked. She hadn't told me because she was afraid of what it meant, for her investment, for her reputation, for our relationship, so she'd said nothing. She'd hoped it would resolve itself. I listened to all of this. I believed most of it. I believed she hadn't known about the contamination. I believed she'd been used, partly because she'd allowed herself to be used, because she'd wanted the opportunity to be real, and so she hadn't looked hard enough at whether it was. I told her, "Your mother spent 8 months collecting water samples to protect people from exactly what you almost helped build on top of." She didn't say anything. I could hear her breathing. "I'm not going to pretend that doesn't hurt," I said, "but I need you to decide right now whether you're in or out. Because what happens next is going to be uncomfortable, and I need to know where you stand." She said, "I'm in. Tell me what to do." What followed over the next 2 months was the most exhausting and, in a strange way, the most meaningful stretch of time I have experienced in my adult life. Clive filed a formal complaint with the BC Ministry of Environment and Climate Change Strategy. Petra's water sample documentation, along with Dr. Falk's independent analysis, formed the core of the submission. Owen compiled the timeline showing the sequence of the original complaint, the regional office's dismissal, and the subsequent move to develop the land. Renee, for her part, provided documentation of the investment solicitation she'd received from Callahan, including the materials he'd shared that made no mention of any environmental concerns. The ministry opened a formal investigation within 3 weeks. That is, I should say, faster than I expected. Clive said it had to do with the combination of documented regulatory failure and potential fraud. It was the kind of file that tends to move once the right people see it clearly. I don't want to make this sound clean or simple, because it wasn't. There were weeks when nothing seemed to be happening, and I'd sit in Alice's garden in the evenings and wonder if I'd miscalculated, if the whole thing was going to get quietly absorbed and nothing would change. There was a phone call, I'll be direct about this, from a lawyer I didn't know, representing interests I could guess at. suggesting that my campaign of harassment against a respected community figure was something I might want to reconsider. I thanked him for his time and called Clive. Clive said, "That call means they're worried. Keep going." Douglas Hearn was formally named in the ministry investigation in October. Callahan cooperated with investigators, apparently deciding that cooperation was preferable to being fully exposed, and his account corroborated what Petra and Owen had already documented. The regional office complaint, it turned out, had been redirected through a senior administrator with long professional ties to Hearn's development network. That administrator resigned before the investigation concluded. Hearn's lawyers fought it hard, but the paper trail was, as Clive put it, persuasive. The remediation order came down the following spring. Northgate Holdings was required to fund a full environmental assessment and remediation plan for the affected parcel, including monitoring of downstream water quality for a minimum of 5 years. The cost estimates I read in the regional paper ran to several $1,000,000. Clive told me it would come out of Hearn's pocket, not the taxpayers. I thought of Petra showing me those lab results across a coffee shop table in Summerland, and of Alice bending over a creek with a little plastic vial. Renee withdrew from the numbered company before any charges were laid. She wasn't implicated. She lost the money she'd put in, not a small amount, and I know that stung, but she sat across from me on my kitchen table one Sunday afternoon in November, the same table where I'd opened Alice's journal, and she said, "Mom would have been so angry at me." And I said, "Your mother was not an angry person." And she said, "She would have made an exception." We both laughed at that. It was the first time we'd laughed together since the funeral. Celia called it justice. Owen called it the system working slowly, like it usually does when it works at all. Petra cried when Clive called her with the news. She'd been carrying those lab reports for over 2 years. I went back to the garden that evening. The lavender was still there along the south fence, going leggy now the way lavender does if you don't cut it back properly. I should have been keeping after it. Alice always kept after it. I thought about her at those watershed meetings, sitting in some community hall in Summerland or Penticton with her notebook and her careful handwriting, asking questions, collecting data, doing the unglamorous work of paying attention to the world around her. She never mentioned it as anything important. She wouldn't have. That was exactly the kind of person she was. She just did the work without needing anyone to notice. She tucked that letter into her journal and never told me about it, because she didn't want to worry me before she knew more, because she thought she was going to get better and handle it herself. I think about that a lot. I think about all the things she was going to handle herself. People have asked me, in the months since, whether I feel like I got justice. It's a harder question to answer than it sounds. Douglas Hearn is still a wealthy man. He'll pay for the cleanup. His lawyers may even find ways to soften what he actually pays directly. And in 5 or 10 years, his name will probably still be on a plaque somewhere. The administrator who redirected the complaint retired with his pension. Troy Callahan is still working in real estate, apparently. The full weight of consequence rarely falls exactly where it should, but the land is being cleaned up. The creek downstream from that parcel will be monitored for 5 years. Families who might have bought homes on contaminated ground will not now do so. And Petra, who kept those lab results in a manila envelope for over 2 years because she didn't know what else to do with them, finally had someone listen. Alice spent 8 months on this. She didn't get to finish it. I finished it for her. That's not nothing. I cut back to lavender last weekend. It took me about an hour. When I was done, it looked the way it's supposed to look. Tidy, manageable, ready to come back strong next season. I don't have Alice's instinct for the garden. I'll probably make mistakes, but I'm learning to pay attention to the things she paid attention to. That's the least I can do. I've been thinking a lot lately about what it actually means to finish something. Not just to see it through to a conclusion, but to carry something forward that someone else had to put down before they were ready. Alice didn't get to finish what she started. That's the part that stays with me. Not the investigation, not Douglas Hearn, not the remediation order. Just the fact that she was partway through something that mattered and she ran out of time. I think about the choices people made in this story and what those choices cost them. Douglas Hearn made the choice at some point to let money be the thing that mattered most. Not once. That kind of decision isn't made once. It's made in small increments, each one a little easier than the last, until one day you're redirecting a legitimate environmental complaint through a compromised administrator, and you no longer think of it as anything remarkable. That's how it works. The erosion is gradual. You don't notice how far you've drifted until the ground gives way. Renee made a different kind of choice. She chose not to look too hard at something she wanted to be true. That's a more human failing, I think. More recognizable, more uncomfortable to sit with. She wanted the opportunity to be real, and so she didn't ask the questions that might have told her it wasn't. I've done versions of that myself over the years. I think most people have. The difference is whether you face it when it's put in front of you, or whether you keep looking away. When I called her that night and told her what I knew, she could have defended herself, made excuses, found a way to reframe it. She didn't. She said she was in. That mattered. In Petra. Petra had carried those lab results in a manila envelope for over 2 years because she didn't know what else to do with them. She'd done everything right. She'd collected the samples, sent them to a proper lab, filed a formal complaint through the correct channels, and the system had simply redirected her complaint into a drawer and closed the drawer. She kept the evidence anyway. That took a kind of quiet stubbornness that I have enormous respect for. She didn't know if anyone would ever listen. She kept it anyway. What I've come to understand sitting in that garden with Alice's lavender coming back every spring, whether I deserve it or not, is that integrity isn't a single decision. It's a direction. It's the accumulation of small choices that either take you toward the kind of person you want to be or quietly away from it. Alice understood that. She didn't join that watershed group because she expected to uncover a conspiracy. She joined it because she thought clean water in her valley was worth paying attention to. That was the whole reason. Something worth paying attention to. I'm not a remarkable man. I taught high school geography for 32 years. I coached hockey. I mowed my lawn on Saturdays and argued with Alice about whether the lavender needed cutting back, and most of the time she was right and I knew it. But I finished what she started, and the creek downstream from that parcel is being monitored now, and the families who might have built their lives on poisoned ground will not do so. That happened because Alice paid attention, and Petra kept the evidence, and Owen made the calls, and Renee chose honesty over self-protection when it counted. None of us did anything heroic. We just didn't look away. That turns out to be enough most of the time. It turns out to be almost everything.